Welcome to Slumber Sea. Tonight we are drifting out across a surface so vast, so quietly alive, that every second breath you have ever taken may have begun here, far from shore, somewhere over deep and open water. Most of us grow up learning that forests are the lungs of the earth. And forests do matter enormously, their canopies exhaling oxygen into the air above rivers and valleys and mountain ranges. But here is a thought worth sitting with as you settle in tonight. The trees and the ferns and the mosses cover only a fraction of this planet. The ocean covers the rest. About 71% of everything beneath the sky above our world is not land at all. It is water. Moving, breathing, circulating water that has been doing a job far larger than most people ever pause to consider. Think about what it means for a single system to hold roughly 97% of all the water on Earth. That is not just a number for a geography lesson. It is a way of beginning to understand the sheer scale of what the ocean is. Scientists estimate the total volume of the world's oceans at approximately 1.335 times 10 to the power of 9 cubic kilometers. Written out, that figure runs well beyond what the mind handles easily, and perhaps that is the point. The ocean is not merely large in the way a continent is large, or even in the way a mountain range is large. It is large in a way that makes it a kind of second atmosphere, a deep and liquid layer wrapped around the solid bones of this planet, constantly exchanging gases with the air above it and the life within it. Now the word lung is a metaphor, and it is worth being careful with metaphors. A lung has a single purpose. It draws air in and pushes air out in a steady mechanical rhythm. The ocean does something more complex than that, something messier and grander and harder to summarize in a single image. But the metaphor earns its place, because at the heart of what the ocean does, at the most fundamental level, there is an exchange. Gases flow in and gases flow out. Carbon moves from the atmosphere into the water. Oxygen moves from the water into the atmosphere. Life is sustained on both sides of that exchange in ways that reach from the smallest microbe to the largest land animal, which is to say, to you and to every person you have ever known. To understand how the ocean manages all of this, you need to think about one of its less visible but most important qualities. Water dissolves gases. Cold water in particular dissolves gases with remarkable generosity. A liter of cold sea water can hold nearly twice as much dissolved oxygen as the same volume of warm water. This simple physical fact is part of why the ocean is not just a passive container, but an active participant in the chemistry of the atmosphere. As water temperatures change, the ocean's capacity to hold and release gases shifts with them, which is one reason scientists watch ocean temperatures with considerable care. But we will come back to that thread a little later. What matters here, at the beginning of this story, is circulation. The ocean is not still. It has never been still. At the surface, the wind drives great sweeping currents that carry warm tropical water toward the poles, spreading heat that would otherwise stay locked in equatorial regions. Without that movement, the tropics would be hotter than they already are, and the higher latitudes would be dramatically colder. The cities of northwestern Europe, to take one well-known example, sit at latitudes comparable to parts of Canada, yet their climates are far milder, in large part because warm Atlantic currents are carrying heat toward them across an open sea. Beneath the surface, the story deepens. Cold, dense, salty water sinks in the polar regions. and begins a slow journey along the ocean floor, creeping through basins and trenches toward the equator, eventually rising again in a process that oceanographers call thermohaline circulation, though it is sometimes described more evocatively as the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. This deep overturning circulation takes centuries to complete a single loop. It connects every ocean basin on the planet. It carries not only heat, but nutrients and dissolved gases from the deep to the sunlit surface layers where life can use them. It is a circulation system in the truest sense, and it keeps the Earth's climate in a kind of slow and delicate balance. So when we call the ocean the lungs of the Earth, we are reaching for something true, even if the image is incomplete. We are trying to name a system that breathes at planetary scale, a system that covers most of the world's surface, holds an almost incomprehensible volume of water, dissolves and releases gases in response to temperature and life and pressure, and moves heat from the equator toward the poles so steadily and so reliably that the climates of entire continents are shaped by it. A system without which the air above would be different, the temperatures below would be more extreme, and the conditions for life as we know it would simply not exist. What drives all of that oxygen production, the biological engine at the center of this planetary lung, is not the forests after all. It is something far smaller, far older, and far harder to see. Something drifting right now in the sunlit skin of the ocean's surface, invisible to the naked eye, working without rest in water that covers most of the world. That is where our story goes next. Imagine holding a single drop of seawater in the palm of your hand. Not a wave, not a current, not even a visible ripple of life. Just one small drop, trembling there, catching the light. Inside that drop, invisible to you, are thousands upon thousands of living organisms. They have no brain, no heart, no lungs of their own. Most of them are single cells so tiny that if you lined them up end to end, it would take several hundred just to span the width of a human hair. And yet, what they are doing inside that drop, what they have been doing for billions of years in every drop across every ocean on this planet, is producing a very large portion of the oxygen in every breath you will take tonight. These organisms are called phytoplankton. The name comes from Greek roots meaning plant and wanderer, which is a reasonably honest description of what they are. They drift. They cannot choose their direction in the way a fish can. They go largely where the currents and the winds take them, carried through the sunlit upper layers of the ocean in their billions upon billions, spread across a surface area that stretches around most of the world. And like the plants on land, they photosynthesize. They take in sunlight, they draw in carbon dioxide dissolved in the water around them. They absorb nutrients that have been carried up from the deep by those great overturning currents. And they use all of those ingredients to build themselves, to grow, to divide, and in doing so to release oxygen as a byproduct. The same basic chemistry that happens in a leaf on a tree is happening right now in the ocean's surface layer on a scale that is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. Scientists estimate that marine phytoplankton collectively generates somewhere around half of the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. It is worth being careful with that figure, because the honest answer is that measuring something this vast and this distributed is not straightforward, and estimates tend to cluster somewhere between 45 and 55%, depending on the methods and models used. But even the lower end of that range is a remarkable fact. Every other breath, roughly speaking, may have its origin not in a forest, but in the open ocean, drawn from organisms too small to see without a microscope. Within that community of phytoplankton, one organism stands out in a way that still quietly astonishes the scientists who study it. It is called Prochlorococcus. It is a cyanobacterium, a type of single-celled photosynthetic microbe, and it holds the distinction of being among the smallest photosynthetic organisms ever discovered. It was only identified in 1988, which is a startling thing to consider. An organism that may account for as much as 20% of global oxygen production, living in uncountable numbers across the tropical and subtropical oceans, was unknown to science less than 40 years ago. Prochlorococcus is not rare. It is, in terms of individual cells, likely one of the most abundant organisms on the planet. It simply required the right instruments and the right researchers asking the right questions before anyone noticed it was there. There is something almost vertiginous about that contrast. The organisms doing some of the most important work on this planet, maintaining the chemical balance of an atmosphere that every air-breathing creature depends on, are invisible. They have no voice. They make no sound. They leave no footprint. They are simply there, in the water, doing what they have always done. Older than plants, older than animals, older than almost anything else that has ever been alive in the way we recognize life. The idea that the ocean played this kind of role, that it was not just a body of water, but a living system producing the air above it, did not always exist. It had to be discovered, and like most scientific discoveries, it arrived gradually through experiments that were asking slightly different questions and found something they were not entirely looking for. In the late 18th century, a chemist named Joseph Priestley conducted a series of experiments that helped establish the relationship between plants and the production of what he called dephlogisticated air, the gas we now call oxygen. He noticed that plants could restore air that had been made unbreathable by burning or by the respiration of animals. Not long after, a Dutch scientist named Jan Ingenhouts refined those findings considerably, demonstrating that it was specifically sunlight that allowed plants to perform this restorative work, and that aquatic plants did it too. Waterweeds placed in sunlight released visible bubbles of gas. Remove the light, and the process stopped. Those experiments were conducted in ponds and bowls and glass jars, with plants large enough to hold between the fingers. But they established something fundamental. Life in water under sunlight produces oxygen. That thread of understanding, pulled from late 18th century laboratories, eventually led scientists toward the ocean and toward the question of what the ocean's own plant life might be contributing to the air above it. The lung metaphor, that idea of the ocean as a breathing system at planetary scale, began to take shape not all at once, but through this kind of accumulating recognition, one experiment building on another across generations of science, until the picture became clear enough to hold. And what the picture shows is this. The oxygen that fills your lungs tonight began, many of its molecules at least, as sunlight hitting water. It passed through the body of a cell so small that the entire organism would be lost on the period at the end of this sentence. It was released into water, rose through the surface, entered the atmosphere, moved with the wind, and eventually found its way into the air around you. That journey is not a metaphor. It is chemistry. It is physics. It is the oldest biological process on Earth, still running, still producing, still quietly maintaining the conditions under which you are able to breathe and drift and rest. The ocean does not just hold oxygen, it makes it. And the makers are not whales or kelp forests or anything dramatic enough to photograph easily. They are the wanderers in the drop of water. They are the invisible engine. They always have been. But the ocean does not only give, it also takes in. And what it takes in quietly and continuously and on a scale that shapes the climate of the entire planet is carbon. Every year, human activity releases enormous quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Burning fuel, clearing forests, manufacturing cement, running the machinery of modern life. The numbers involved are large enough to be difficult to picture clearly. And yet, when scientists measure how much of that carbon actually accumulates in the atmosphere, they find that it is less than the total amount being released. Some of it is absorbed by land vegetation, and nearly 30% of it, year after year, disappears into the ocean. 30%. That is not a small adjustment. That is the ocean silently intercepting roughly a third of the carbon that human civilization is pouring into the air and pulling it downward, into the water, where it is held and processed, and in many cases kept out of the atmosphere for a very long time. The ocean manages this through two distinct but related processes. The first is chemical. Carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater the way it dissolves into any liquid, the same principle that puts the fizz into a cold drink. The surface of the ocean is in constant exchange with the air above it, and when the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere rises, more of it crosses that boundary and enters the water. This happens passively, driven by the simple physics of gas and liquid reaching toward equilibrium. It requires no living thing to initiate it. The chemistry does the work on its own. The second process does require life. It is called the biological carbon pump, and it is one of the more extraordinary mechanisms operating on this planet, largely unnoticed and largely unsung. It begins in the same sunlit surface waters we have already visited, with those drifting photosynthetic cells drawing carbon dioxide out of the water around them to build their own bodies. When those organisms die, or when they are eaten and their carbon passes through the bodies of the creatures that consumed them, some of that carbon sinks. Fragments of cells, discarded organic material, the remains of small animals that feed on the plankton, all of it drifts downward through the water column, falling slowly toward the deep ocean. Scientists sometimes call it marine snow. It is a quiet, constant, invisible fall of organic matter descending through the darkness below the surface layer. And as it sinks deeper, something important happens. In the upper ocean, decomposition is relatively rapid. Much of the carbon gets recycled back into the water near the surface and eventually re-enters the atmosphere. But some portion of this material sinks far enough that it passes below the depth at which those surface processes can reach it. It enters the deep ocean, a realm so cold and so dark and so slow-moving that carbon can remain there for centuries, in some cases for millennia. Buried in sediment on the ocean floor, it is effectively removed from the active climate system for timescales that stretch far beyond any human frame of reference. To put the scale of this storage into perspective, the total amount of carbon held in the ocean is estimated to be roughly 60 times greater than the amount currently in the atmosphere. The ocean is not merely a participant in the carbon cycle. It is the dominant reservoir. It is the place where the vast majority of carbon that cycles through the surface of the Earth is ultimately held. Without it, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide would be radically higher than it is, and the planet would be radically warmer. But the ocean does not hold carbon in isolation. It is also a machine that moves heat. The same great overturning circulation that carries nutrients upward from the deep ocean also redistributes warmth from the tropics toward the poles. Cold, dense water sinks in certain regions of the high latitudes, particularly the North Atlantic and around Antarctica, drawing surface water in from elsewhere and driving a global conveyor of moving water that shapes the climate of continents. The temperature of the ocean off the coast of northwestern Europe, the patterns of rainfall across the tropics, the timing of monsoon seasons in distant parts of the world, all of these are entangled with how the ocean circulates. Carbon storage and heat distribution are not separate functions. They are woven together through the same physical system, operating across the same vast body of water. What makes all of this both remarkable and slightly unsettling to contemplate is that it is not guaranteed to continue at its current rate. Scientists are actively studying what happens to the biological carbon pump as the ocean warms. Warmer surface water is less dense, which tends to increase what is called stratification, a strengthening of the invisible boundary between the warm upper layer and the cold, deep water below. When that stratification intensifies, it becomes harder for nutrients to mix upward from the deep, which means less food for phytoplankton, which means potentially less carbon being fixed near the surface and less available to sink. Whether and how quickly this will reduce the efficiency of the pump, and by how much, remains an open and actively contested question in climate science. The models do not all agree. The observations were still accumulating. This is an area where genuine uncertainty lives. What is not uncertain is the role the ocean has played until now. For as long as human civilization has existed, and for hundreds of millions of years before that, the ocean has been absorbing carbon, drawing it downward, locking it away in the deep, and in doing so acting as a thermostat for the climate system of the entire planet. It has been regulating the atmosphere not just by filling it with oxygen, but by preventing it from filling with something else. The lung metaphor extends further than most people realize. The ocean does not only breathe out, it breathes in. And what it has been breathing in, quietly and without recognition, is the chemical consequence of almost everything we have ever burned. But just as the air we breathe can become thin at high altitudes, the water that sustains ocean life can become starved of oxygen. And as the planet warms, that is exactly what is beginning to happen. One of the quieter but more consequential facts in ocean science is that warm water simply cannot hold as much dissolved gas as cold water can. The physics are straightforward. Gas molecules have an easier time escaping from a warm liquid than from a cold one. In practical terms, that means a bucket of icy seawater drawn from a polar current can carry almost twice as much oxygen as a similarly salty bucket of tropical surface water. For a very long time, the planet's temperature gradients and circulation patterns kept that imbalance in check. Cold, oxygen-rich waters formed at high latitudes, sank and crept through the deep ocean, while wind and waves mixed surface layers and brought fresh oxygen down from the atmosphere. Fish and crabs and worms and microbes lived within the boundaries set by that steady, if uneven, supply. But when we increase the temperature of the surface ocean, even by a few degrees, the balance shifts. The same chemical rule takes over. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen. At the same time, a warmer surface tends to become more stratified, more sharply separated from the cooler water below. It is a bit like putting a lid on a pot. The mixing that used to stir the water column weakens. The oxygen at the top has a harder time making its way downward. The oxygen stored in the depths has a harder time rising back up. This double effect, reduced capacity to hold oxygen and reduced mixing to distribute what remains, is one of the reasons scientists have been watching the global ocean with increasing concern. When they lower instruments that can sense dissolved oxygen into the sea, from ships and from autonomous floats that drift with the currents, they are not just taking isolated snapshots. They are building a time series, a record that stretches from the late 20th century into the present. And when they compare those records, they see a pattern emerging. There are regions in the ocean known as oxygen minimum zones, layers at intermediate depths where oxygen levels drop to very low values. These zones are naturally occurring. They tend to form in areas where surface waters are highly productive, where phytoplankton bloom in great numbers, and where the sinking organic material from those blooms is decomposed by bacteria that use up oxygen in the process. Up above, near the surface, there is plenty of oxygen, refreshed by contact with the atmosphere and by photosynthesis. Down below, in the deep ocean, the slow-moving but cold and oxygen-rich waters formed at the poles still retain much of their supply. In between, in that mid-water band, there exists a twilight world that, even in the best of times, is precariously low in breath. In recent decades, those oxygen minimum zones have been growing. Some have thickened vertically, expanding their depth range. Others have stretched horizontally, spreading out along coasts and across open basins. Measurements from the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and parts of the Atlantic all point in the same direction. The total volume of water that is severely depleted in oxygen is increasing. For the creatures that live in these regions, or that must migrate through them, this is not an abstract change. Fish, like us, are limited by how efficiently they can extract oxygen from their environment. They have evolved to operate within certain bounds. When those bounds are squeezed from above and below, warmer water near the surface with less oxygen, and a thickening band of poorly ventilated water beneath, the habitable space in between can narrow. Some species respond by moving, shifting their ranges toward cooler, more oxygenated waters if they can. Others, particularly those tied to specific habitats such as continental shelves or upwelling zones, have fewer options. As oxygen levels fall below critical thresholds, entire strata of the water column can become effectively off-limits for large animals, turning once three-dimensional habitats into thinner, compressed layers. Scientists sometimes speak of habitat compression and of fish being forced into smaller vertical slices where they are more exposed to predators and to fishing gear. The consequences ripple outward. Many of the world's major fisheries draw on species that use oxygen-sensitive regions during key parts of their life cycles. Changes in oxygen availability can alter growth rates, reproduction, and survival. Food webs that extend from tiny zooplankton up through forage fish to larger predators can be reconfigured if one link becomes constrained. And because these zones often intersect with coastal regions where human communities rely heavily on the sea for protein and livelihoods, the expansion is not just an ecological concern, it is a social and economic one as well. This is one of the ways in which the ocean's lung-like function can be weakened. If vast areas of the sea become chronically low in oxygen, the capacity of those waters to host abundant, diverse life diminishes. The microbial communities that dominate low-oxygen environments tend to process carbon and nutrients differently from those in well-oxygenated waters. That can feed back into how efficiently the biological carbon pump operates, how much organic material sinks and is buried, and how much is transformed and returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or other gases. None of this is a simple on-off switch. The ocean is not about to suddenly stop producing oxygen or abruptly cease absorbing carbon. But the evidence now suggests that the finely tuned balance of processes that has made the ocean such a reliable life support system is being nudged bit by bit away from the conditions under which it developed. The precise trajectory remains uncertain. Different climate models make different predictions about how quickly and how extensively oxygen minimum zones will expand, and how much the biological carbon pump will be altered. There is real scientific debate over the numbers and the timelines. At the same time, there is broad agreement that continued warming will push in the same general direction, toward a more stratified, less well-ventilated ocean with more frequent and more extensive regions of low oxygen. That, in turn, raises questions not only about reducing the stresses we are placing on this vast system, but about whether we should attempt to deliberately intervene in how it functions. One of the more discussed proposals in this area is something called ion fertilization. The basic idea arises from a simple observation. In many parts of the open ocean, there is plenty of dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus, but very little iron. Iron is a micronutrient that phytoplankton need to photosynthesize efficiently. In those iron-poor regions, phytoplankton growth is limited not by the bulk nutrients, but by this trace metal. If you add iron, experiments suggest, the phytoplankton can bloom. From this has grown the suggestion that we might scatter finely powdered iron over certain stretches of ocean on purpose, creating artificial blooms of phytoplankton that would draw more carbon dioxide out of the surface waters and, eventually, send more carbon raining down into the deep as marine snow. A kind of intentional boost to the biological carbon pump, using the ocean's own microscopic machinery to help pull more carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the sea. It is an idea that sits at the intersection of hope and unease. On the hopeful side, ion fertilization appears, at least on paper, to be a way of amplifying a natural process rather than inventing an entirely new one. It does not require building vast industrial machines. It uses the living engine already present in the water. Some early small-scale experiments did indeed observe temporary increases in phytoplankton biomass when iron was added. But when scientists look more closely, the picture becomes more complicated. Not all of the extra carbon drawn into those blooms sinks. A portion is rapidly recycled near the surface and returns to the atmosphere. The fraction that does make it deeper may not be large enough, in many cases, to produce a substantial long-term drawdown. There are questions about which species of phytoplankton flourish under fertilization and what that means for food webs and for the production of other climate-relevant gases, such as nitrous oxide or dimethyl sulfide. There are questions about whether stimulating decomposition at depth could, in some places, worsen local oxygen depletion. There is also the broader ethical and political concern of deliberately engineering a system as complex and as deeply interconnected as the global ocean, when our understanding of all the feedbacks is still incomplete. Some researchers argue that, in a world struggling to rapidly reduce emissions, we should at least explore these options carefully, gathering data that might be needed in an emergency. Others caution that the promise of geoengineering could distract from the primary task of cutting the amount of carbon we emit in the first place, or that large-scale manipulation of ocean ecosystems could lead to consequences we cannot easily reverse. At this point, iron fertilization remains largely experimental and heavily debated. It is a focal point for a larger conversation about how far humans should go in deliberately tuning the planetary systems on which we depend. The ocean has been regulating our climate and chemistry for hundreds of millions of years without our guidance. We are only just beginning to understand the depth of its influence and the limits of its resilience. What is becoming clear, though, is that the ocean's role as a planetary lung is both powerful and vulnerable. It has buffered us by creating oxygen, by absorbing carbon, and by moving heat around the globe in ways that soften extremes. But it is not an infinite, unbreakable reservoir. Warming, acidification, pollution, overfishing, and expanding low oxygen zones are all stresses that press on this system at once. Protecting the ocean, reducing emissions, limiting damage to coastal habitats, giving marine ecosystems room to adapt, is not a separate task from protecting the air we breathe. They are the same task, viewed from different angles. And continuing to study the ocean, to send instruments into the depths, to listen to what changes are unfolding, is part of learning how to live within the limits of the very system that keeps us alive. If there is a single thought to carry with you after this journey, it is that the blue on the map is not empty space. It is a living, breathing organ of the earth, exhaling much of the oxygen in our lungs and quietly inhaling much of the carbon from our fires. If you found this exploration calming or thought-provoking, please consider liking this video, subscribing to Slumber Sea, and sharing it with someone who might drift off to it. And I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Leave a comment with your corner of the world, and let the ocean's vastness hold us all together for a while.